Now, back in this country, Albertans have been through an awful lot in the last couple of years. Crude prices are still well off the highs that fueled the meteoric rise of the oil sands. Meanwhile, the province is still recovering from the ravages of a wildfire so large it was called the Beast. So, how do Albertans view themselves and the rest of the country? In light of all of this, the CBC and Angus Reid Institute teamed up to get some insight. Shachi Kurl is Executive Director at the Angus Reid Institute. I want you to sort of walk us through some of these findings that you found. The first one that we're going to look at is the question of whether my province contributes more to the country than it gets back. What did you find in response to that?
Well, Peter, what you really see is a sense, apparently in Alberta and Saskatchewan particularly, that these provinces feel like they're lifting more than their weight in terms of what they give to the country versus get back. In both provinces, more than 80% feel that way, compared to much lower numbers in some other parts of the country.
For sure. I mean, Atlantic Canada was looking at sort of 45%, Ontario only at 63, and Manitoba at 51. So when you compare that to that 86 number, it really adds up. That gap is enormous. The one that really jumped out at me, I'll be honest, was the question, my province is treated fairly by a national government. I've lived in the Maritimes and in Quebec and here in Ontario and out west. This is always a controversial question. Walk us through the findings.
You know what? It's always a controversial question, but again, Alberta, the real outlier here. Just about 1/3 say that they feel that they are being treated in a way that is satisfying them on this question. You compare that to folks in Manitoba, folks in British Columbia, even in Ontario. Again, some big differences. And those differences really give us a sense of how people are feeling in that province and in other provinces, obviously, about their own sense of place and confederation. Questions of respect, questions of fairness weighing very much on the minds of people in those two western provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, these days.
36% in Alberta. I mean, that's down at sort of Quebec levels in the 1990s, isn't it?
Well, you know, I like to say that we have a new Two Solitudes emerging, and I think the survey results from this poll really speak to that. You know, a generation ago, 20 years ago, if we had said that there is a province where only 1/3 feel that they are, you know, being treated with that kind of fairness, if respect is lacking, we would have said, aha, we know which province we're talking about. And we might have been thinking about Quebec, but actually it is Alberta these days. And look, a lot of this is driven by what's been going on economically. You had Alberta at the forefront of the oil economy and the oil boom when times were good, when oil prices were high. Now they're not. Massive job losses. So that has a huge impact on the psyche of Albertans, and just in terms of what they at an individual household level are dealing with in terms of their anxiety, their angst, those kitchen table issues. Can I pay my bills? Can I balance my checkbook? Can I send my kid to school or give them the extras that I'd like to give them? That's having a major impact on this. But of course, the big debate and the tug of war over where we stand on the oil economy versus the environment is also driving a lot of this, because again, that's a province that finds itself an outlier in terms of how it's thinking.
Indeed, and I think there's some really interesting data in that on the one hand, that we just went through, my province is treated fairly by the national government, and you touched on my province is respected by the rest of the country. Only 45% of people in Alberta feel they're respected, and I think you can get that right now. We're looking at these numbers here. You can get that right now when they're looking at, you know, an inability to get their pipelines built. The economy is falling apart, and yet when you look at the next question, which is which of these do you think of Canada's oil industry as, whether Canada's oil industry was an asset or a liability, you see the rest of the country really looks at Alberta as wildly in favor of it being an asset.
Absolutely. So the majority view on this, by the way, the big national number is nearly 70% of us actually see the oil industry as a net asset because of what it's able to do for the economy. But again, hugely driven by views in Alberta and Saskatchewan. You look at that number in Quebec, it's much more milquetoast, although it is important to point out that majorities in every province do feel that way. But, of course, there's a follow-up question. And the follow-up question around that is, if you have to pick, if there's one way to go versus the other, do we pick, protecting the environment, even if it means, not promoting or putting as much attention into the oil economy and the energy industry, or do you pick that because of its contribution to the economy? And what you find is that the majority of Canadians across the board, and you will see, again, big regional and provincial differences, but the majority of Canadians still tilt towards protecting the environment over promoting that oil and energy economy. And so while we have actually changed quite a bit over the last generation on this question, I mean, 20 years ago, we were much, much more pro-environment over economy. It's still the majority view, and it is still really the majority of Albertans who find themselves on a different side of this conversation and this debate than people in other provinces.
Which I guess leads us to our last question, and simply put, are Albertans optimistic about the future?
You know what? Albertans have a very sort of, as we know, stand-up, can-do attitude. So when it comes to their own personal futures, they say, yes, I'm optimistic. And of course, some of that is driven by the fact that there have been good times in Alberta up until recently. And so, the financial base that a lot of Albertans have been able to build for themselves still exists, even if they're drawing down on it right now. But when it comes to their outlook in the future of their province, of the country, and especially their outlook for the next generation, you see a great deal of pessimism in Alberta these days, driven namely by what's been going on economically, and also just a sense that the things that they hold as important are really losing ground in the national discussion.
Well, it's a fascinating conversation. It's really interesting data. We really appreciate you coming on the show to walk us through it all.
Hey, it's my pleasure, and if anybody wants to see more, they can download the full data sets at angusreid.org.
Good stuff. Thanks for this.
Thanks, Peter.